My name is John Cornicello, and I welcome you to my series of live interactive photo conversations. You can check out the schedule at cornicello.com/conversations. You can get the dates and times of upcoming shows and also links to previous shows there. Those recordings are all on YouTube. Today, my guest is John Miskelly. One of the great things about these conversations is getting to meet photographers from around the world that I never would have had a chance to before. John is one of those that I met here, and I'm happy to have him as a guest today to talk about capturing time in long exposure landscape photography. So please welcome John Miskelly.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I appreciate the invite, and good to see everybody here. I was going to say this evening is evening here in Ireland, but not necessarily in all the places that are represented today. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen, which should hopefully work. Okay. I assume you can all see a clock.
Yep.
Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to chat about a little bit about through the history of where I've come from, and then talk about long exposure landscapes specifically. But at any stage, if people have got questions, we're all amongst friends. Feel free to chip in, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, this is called Capturing Time, Long Exposure Landscapes, and just a very brief mention to Lee Filters. I'm a Lee Filters master, and I'm also a Canson Infinity ambassador. The early journey, it's always good to start off early. Really, I was a social photographer and a travel photographer and all those wonderful things until 2008. And in 2008, Venice, and that was really the start of landscapes. It's the start of me getting up early in the morning, going out to get the sunrise, which was a bit of a shock to the system for somebody that was never a morning person. So of course, when you go to Venice, you shoot the traditional type of shots that you see here from St. Mark's Square, and also from the Rialta Bridge. We'll talk more about Venice as we go through the talk, but this was very early days, and you can see as an example of this, this was I think this was an 8 megapixel Canon at the time, and because I was shooting in fairly high ISO in the evening, you can see a lot of noise in the shadows, and it just illustrates how much technology has progressed over the years, so we can get clean images at high ISO and multi-megapixel cameras. So this was, as I say, the start of a landscape journey. I was taking images locally around the coast of Ireland. This is in the Mournes near Newcastle, a place called Bloody Bridge. And this was the sort of thing I was shooting, fairly traditional sunrise, from the foot of the mountains, from the foot of the river here, over the rocks. And you'll see some early shots where the sun is in the frame. But as time goes on, I never, or virtually never, now shoot the sun in the frame. Another one from Ireland, from a Game of Thrones location. For all those that follow Game of Thrones, this is Dunluce Castle, up on the north coast of Northern Ireland, and just a lovely location, this old historical Irish castle. And we've got lots of great landscapes around the coastline, probably about an hour and a half's drive from my house. And again, this is the sort of thing I'm shooting at this stage. Again, along the north coast, the Giant's Causeway, probably the most famous part of the Northern Ireland coastline, and there's this every year. The hexagonal columns of this is quite rare to be actually able to get this shot without loss of movement. But this was a bit of a long exposure. This was 30 seconds, so it wasn't the long exposures I do nowadays, but still a little bit towards that. And as time went on, I traveled around and was doing different things. A lot of my images in those days were panoramas, which is what I started off specializing in, panorama images, very often stitched together afterwards. So this was actually 3 images stitched together. This is the Channel Islands between England and France, a place called Plymouth Bay. Hard to believe that 15 minutes earlier, these rocks were totally covered by the sea. The Channel Lines have one of the biggest tidal ranges around this part of the world, something like 10 meters of a range, which is really quite significant. So you have to time it just right. And this was November time, and the only place I could get to where I wanted to get this shot was actually standing in water about thigh deep. So I wasn't really particularly prepared for landscape system. It was a case of shoes, socks, and trousers off. Standing in this water up to my thighs, trying to get this shot, because if I stood to the left, the rocks merged with the headland. If I stood the same thing happened. And as we go through this talk, you'll see one of my big things is around composition. I'm a bit anal about getting good compositions and not having a shot that's too busy. Again, panoramic type images. This is in Scotland, the Old Man of Stores, quite a famous location that lots of people have photographed over the years. This was the very first time I went. It was February time, but I was still up at something like 3:30 in the morning because I was a couple of hours away from this location. And when I parked at the roadside, I still had an hour to walk to get up. And I was with a friend of mine, a couple of friends actually, and the mist was swirling around these stone stacks and no indication that we're going to get any sort of nice light whatsoever. But I thought, let's just keep going because you never know what happens in the landscape. And just as we came along the path up to these, just above these rocks, suddenly the clouds cleared and we got this most beautiful sunrise. And this is about 8 shots stitched together to give this long exposure panorama. The problem with that was because it happened so quickly and it didn't last very long, I just had to really grab what I could. And I then went back, I think it was probably a year later, just to see if I could get something even nicer. So off I went. It was May time, and because it was May, sunrise is really quite early. And the last thing I wanted to do was be getting up at like 1 a.m. So I decided to take my luxury accommodation with me, staying in my tent. And typical of Scotland in May, we had hail the night before. You can see the hail on the grass here. But the very next morning, whenever I got up at whatever, 5:30 or 6 to get sunrise, this is what I was faced with. And this is the joy of being a landscape photographer. Low cloud, it actually never cleared. It was quite grey, and in fact, the weather got worse. So all you can do in a case like that is head back down and find somewhere nice for breakfast and a good mug of tea. And that's always the solution to these sort of situations. Staying, sorry, I should have said that last one in the Old Man of Store was actually in the Isle of Skye off the west coast of Scotland, a great favourite of mine, Scotland. And this is another place on the Isle of Skye called Elgol. It's become even more popular since I photographed this quite a number of years ago. And I found that this was where I wanted to be. I'd been watching the weather all day. It had been raining throughout the day, but the weather forecast was indicating at about 4 p.m. The light was going to improve, the rain was going to stop. And because this, again, was February time, sunset was just after 5 p.m. Our time. So I got into position, and it's the old story of the landscape photographer. You're just waiting for the light. And about 20 minutes before sunset, I got this most glorious, lovely, soft golden light. And this is a stitched panorama as well. I think it's about 4 or 5 images. And these were 30-second exposures. So you get a little bit of mistiness in the water and a bit of softness in the sky. Sometimes people ask me, how do you cope with long exposures, joining them together? Well, it's actually much easier when your water is so soft and your sky is so soft. It's quite straightforward to do that. The interesting thing was that about 5 minutes after I took this shot, 3 people came, set up their tripods directly in front of me. And I watched them for a moment or two, and eventually I said, excuse me, guys, you realize you're right in my shot. And it's fairly unrepeatable what they said, but basically along the lines, well, you don't own this landscape, we can go wherever we want. And it's a bit of a shame when people haven't got the manners to keep out of each other's way. I've been in cases many times where people are in my shot or where I maybe want to be. I just find somewhere different, but there you go, such is life. And the last one of this section, I was heading home, having spent some time on Skye, and this is a place called Eilean Donan Castle, again, quite a well-known location. And I was heading to get the ferry back to Northern Ireland. It was about a 6-hour drive, and I stopped, and it was a grey, you can see by the sky, it was quite a grey day, but I could see a break in the clouds, and I thought maybe that sun will just move around and light up the castle. And I had about 20 minutes of a gap. And of course, 20 minutes went by and it had moved, but no, not enough. So I waited for another 15 minutes and still wasn't there. Actually, after nearly an hour, the sun came around and lit the castle and I got the shot. The problem was I had to make a bit of a mad dash to get the ferry, and I just about got it and nearly missed it. But it's always worth it to get the shot. There's always another ferry afterwards if needs be. But again, this is 30-second exposures, 8 images stitched together for the panorama. And again, this is sort of, I suppose, hinting at what I was going to be doing more and more of, which was long exposures.
So are you doing your stitching in Photoshop or in another program or Lightroom?
I mean, I think Photoshop in those days did do stitching, but it was very basic, John. So I used a thing called GUI Pro, which is a dedicated piece of stitching software.
What was the name again? It broke up.
GUI Pro.
Okay.
Letters GUI Pro,
Mhm.
and it's dedicated stitching. It wasn't always the easiest to use, but it gave very good results if you knew how to use it. Photoshop has improved dramatically over the years. And if it's a simple stitch, I would now use Photoshop. Only use PTGui for the complex ones.
Great.
So, long exposure, what is it? The definition I find of long exposure is involving a long duration to sharply capture the stationary elements. And really that's the key to the whole thing. Now, I suppose the obvious question from that is, what does long duration actually mean? Well, there's no formal definition, but it's commonly taken to mean exposures ranging from a few seconds to minutes or even hours. I'm quite a fan of a chap called Michael Kenna, which I'm sure many of you know. And Michael would often do nighttime shots, and typically some of his shots can be 4, 5, 6 hours long, although he is shooting in film, which brings a different set of challenges. There was recently a story in the news, can't remember if it was in the States or in Europe, where somebody had put a pinhole camera on an observatory with a piece of sensitized paper. And frankly, they had forgotten about it. And 8 years later, somebody found this camera and they took it and they exposed it, or sorry, not exposed, they developed the piece of paper. And actually there was an image on this paper after 8 years in this pinhole camera. I don't profess to do 8 years. Typically I'm working between 4 and 8 minutes. I think if it was 8 years, I think I'd get a bit bored. And this is typically what you'll see. This was myself on the north coast of Northern Ireland in a summer's day in July. You can see how good the weather is in Ireland. It's pouring with rain. Place called Port Stewart. And the umbrella is not to stop my hair going curly, contrary to popular belief, but really to keep the water off the filters in front of the camera, which is a real pain in the backside. And this was the shot that I took from the other side of those posts. And this was probably the start, around about 2015, the start of my, what I maybe call the fine art, which maybe sounds slightly precocious, form of long exposure photography, mainly in the square format. I just like square, no particular reason. I usually shoot on a DSLR. I've shot in digital backs. None of the digital sensors are square, but that's the way I tend to crop my images. I usually shoot in portrait format, so I get the edges in the frame right. And then I'm just cropping you to the sky and quite often the sea, top and bottom.
Yeah, questions come into the chat from Richard. Is there a preferred focal length you like to use when stitching together?
Yeah, I tend to use mainly 24 mil. For a long time, I worked on a fixed 24 mil tilt shift lens, a Nikon lens. Even if I didn't use it in tilt shift format, I just liked the 24. It's a sort of a fairly standard landscape lens. Nowadays, I've been shooting on the Nikon Z series cameras, so I actually use their 24-70 zoom. But again, I still usually shoot on the 24 mil end of the range.
That's interesting. I always think of shooting longer lenses for panoramas from a distance and making it easier to stitch.
Yeah, no, I've always worked on 24. I tend to work on the wider. I used to carry a 21 mil Zeiss lens with me, but I once I get much wider than 24, it can make the thing look a little bit, I find, artificial. Foreground and background. You can't compress the two with a longer lens, but you have to take more images if you're going to stitch using a longer lens. So a few times I did do longer lenses, particularly in Tuscany, and I was stitching 20 odd images, maybe 3 rows of 7 or 8 per row, and that just became clumsy and awkward, to be honest. So I'd rather stitch 4 images.
How many images do you typically stitch?
Typically 6. I would typically take 6, 7 images on a stitch to give me that look that I would have used before.
Yeah. Are you going
to cover? Do an awful lot.
Are you going to cover what filtration you use?
Yeah, we're going to talk about filtration more now with these long exposures coming up.
Okay,
So a
great.
bit of a tour around, start off with Scotland. And what I'm going to do here is show you the image before any filters go on at all. So this was I was on my way to somewhere you'll see in a moment called St. Monans. And I stopped off in this place called Burnt Island. It's near Edinburgh in Scotland. It's an old shipbuilding town, and it's got that sort of decay of an old shipbuilding town that it still does some industrial work for wind turbines and oil rigs, but the shipbuilding industry is long gone. Most of it's moved to the Far East. But I quite like this sort of rusty light at the end of the pier. And as I say, this is before any filters. So I put usually a 2-stop or a 3-stop graduated neutral density filter on for the sky. And that will give me that. And then I'll put a long exposure filter, in this case, a 10-stop, to give me what's called, Lee called a big stopper. And that gives me what would have been, I'm guessing that might have been at, let's say, a 30th of a second. And that becomes 30 seconds. In fact, I'll tell you, it's not a big stopper, it's a super stopper. And a super stopper gives me much longer exposures, and this one was because it was shot during the day. And if you take, for example, a super stopper, if I get onto 1/2 of a second, 125th of a second, and I put a super stopper, which is 15 stops on the front, that will take me to 4 minutes. So that's the difference it makes. So what would be a fairly normal exposure on a normal day suddenly becomes an 8-minute long exposure, which is what this is. And this is straight out of camera. This is a raw file with nothing done to it. And you often get a bit, particularly in the grayish day, you get a slight blue tinge in the light. And so what I will do, I'll crop it afterwards and remove the blue tinge. It's quite easy to do in Lightroom or Photoshop. All I do is really change the color temperature, and that just gives you a more neutral color here. It's almost sort of monochromatic, but you can see a bit of green on the pier and then a bit of rust on the end of the pier. If you look clearly, you can see the bridges in Edinburgh in the background, which are about 6 or 7 miles away, which just highlights how good the digital sensors are in today's modern cameras, that it can pick up that sort of detail even in the distance. But I was actually heading to this location. It's an interesting breakwater in a village called St. Monans, about 40 miles from Edinburgh, on the Firth of Forth, for anybody familiar with that part of the world. And I specifically went across to Scotland for a couple of days just to photograph this particular breakwater. And this is the image before any filters at all. And again, that's with a graduated filter. And in this case, this is definitely a big stopper. This is a 10-stop filter. Now, the big stopper, anybody who's familiar with Lee filters will know that the big stopper makes things quite blue. And Lee deliberately put the blue tint, if you like, into their filters because it reduces the amount of infrared light getting onto the sensor, which can cause different problems. And again, as I said before, it's quite easy to remove the blue. And that's it with the blue removed. You'll notice I'm now not shooting into the sun. The sun is setting off to my left, obviously the west. And really that's, or sorry, my right, I'm looking southwards here. This is off to my right, west, getting mixed up. And the rock to the left of the breakwater is actually separated from the breakwater. It's only a few millimeters, but there is separation there. And again, I don't like things to merge into each other from a compositional point of view. The other thing I will often do is not quite across the middle, but often I have horizons across the middle of the screen. And you'll hear lots of people, judges and photographers and so on, saying, oh, you shouldn't do that. You should use a rule of thirds and a rule of this and so on. And I don't really like rules. I think rules are there as guidelines. And I'm not saying that the idea of thirds doesn't work. It does. But be prepared to change things and experiment and see what works for you. I went back to the same location the following morning, and the tide was lower, and you'll see that rock to the left is now fully exposed. You can see all the rocks that the breakwater is sitting on as a foundation. And while it's an interesting enough little image, it's a lot less clean, a lot less simplistic than the previous image, which is why I prefer the previous one. Later on that morning, I actually went to shoot this particular bridge. It's called the Disappearing Bridge. This is probably about an hour's drive or an hour and a half's drive away. The difficulty, because it's not my local area, I didn't realize the tide this specific day wasn't going to be high enough, and it never really got much higher than what it is here. When you get a high tide, you lose the path in front and all the sand around it, and you just bridge in the middle of, just looks like it's in the middle of the sea. It would have made quite an interesting composition, but on this occasion, as I say, the tide wasn't quite high enough, and I haven't gone back to shoot it since. So then it was very much a case of, was there something else I could find locally? And of all things, I found a nuclear power station, as you do. Not your typical landscape photography option, but this was a place called Torness Nuclear Power Station, again, not too far from Edinburgh. And I decided that this was far too messy, and I simplified this image and just shot the sort of, I don't know what you would call it, the concrete structure on the right-hand side, and isolated that down. And I was very careful to make sure the horizon was halfway between the top of that wall and the bottom rail of the fence around it. And that's the sort of thing, when you're doing 4 and 8 minute exposures, you don't have the luxury of taking lots of shots and hoping one of them works. You maybe get the light to work for, if you're lucky, a couple of shots usually. So I'll spend time composing it correctly in camera. It reminds me of my early days in photography when I used to use film. And film was obviously, particularly if you're using medium format or sheets of film, it's expensive, and therefore you can't afford just to sort of do the shotgun style that digital cameras tends to lead us to do these days.
There's a question came in asking, can you use a set of ND filters and combine them like a 3, 6, and 10 overshooting with the 15? Is there any issues with stacking?
It's a very good question. It's like everything else. If you use good quality filters, and I mean, other makes are certainly available, then you'll probably get away with that okay. Before there was a 15-stop filter, I used to stack a 10-stop, a 6-stop, and I would also use a graduated filter as well. And most of the time I wouldn't have problems. Occasionally you get a spurious light reflection between the filters, but that was quite rare. But it's like everything else. I remember one time somebody going on a workshop I was running, and they sent me this link beforehand to some filters they were planning on buying. And it was on Amazon, and it was a number of rings for different sized filter threads on lenses. It had a holder. It had a number of graduated neutral density filters and a big stopper of 2 or 3 different grades. And the whole thing was £19.95. So what, $25, $30? And I remember going back to the guy and saying, how much have you spent on your camera and your lens? And he came back and said, a couple of $1,000 or $2,500. I said, well, if you think putting $30 of cheap plastic in front of your lens is going to do it any good, then you maybe want to reconsider that idea. So it's like anything, put if you're going to do something like that, put decent filters in front of your lens, and you'll have less likelihood of problems. This is back up at the Isle of Skye that you saw earlier on. A lot of people don't know this lighthouse exists because this is a road bridge across from the mainland to the island. And when you drive in this bridge either direction, just the way the bridge is constructed, you can't see this lighthouse. So I always say to people, go and explore, go and see what you see, and you never know what you'll find. And this lighthouse and the bridge together were something that just appealed to me. And the only post-production I've done to this is the signs off the front of the bridge, which indicate the height, and lightened it a little bit there and cropped it down to square. The one thing that you will find if you use graduated filters, if anything is going into the sky, whether it be a bridge like this or rocks or whatever, it'll probably darken that. So I use a very soft graduated filter. So the graduation between the dark part of the filter and the light part is quite gentle. And then it means in post-production, if needs be, as I probably did in this one, I can just take a brush and Lightroom and very slightly lighten the bridge to the top. And it's quite easy to correct for that. So I was heading off to a place, I'm sure some people here won't know it, but there's a location called the Outer Hebrides, which is further off the coast of Scotland, quite wild and rugged islands. And this was my photographic assistant called Sam, a 3-legged Springer Spaniel with the energy of a Springer Spaniel, even with 3 legs. Unfortunately, Sam passed away there just recently, but he was my sort of assistant during the photography. This is just a snapshot of the location. It's not that widely, it's reasonably well known, I suppose, but very few people go there. It's not the easiest place to get to, and a lot of people just avoid it. Yet you've got beaches like this with nobody on them. And this middle beach you can see here in the midground is called Celebust. A lot of the names are Viking names because these islands were inhabited by the Vikings many centuries ago. And this next shot is shot from that beach looking back roughly to where I'm standing now. And it's very much a case of finding the simplicity of shapes in the sand, or it can be the edge of the water itself, or it could be a rock. I'm looking for very simple compositions to lead the eye in. And this is a case where the sun actually was setting on the horizon, but because it's behind the clouds, it's diffused. And the reason I don't like the traditional sunset with the sun in the sky is that the human eye can see, along with the brain, about 24 stops of light. But even with filters and everything on our modern day cameras, we can't cope with that. In fact, a modern day sensor will cope with maybe 12 to 14 stops of light. So the human eye can cope much more with brightness. And I don't like to see this burned out blob on a print. So that's why I tend to avoid it. Or if the sun is there, I look behind cloud and let it be diffused, it works okay. But just to show in the same location on a different day, about 100 meters to the right, a totally different image. And again, sometimes people say to me, but I've been to that place before, I don't need to go back. Well, particularly if you're a seascape photographer, as I am, beaches are constantly changing. They're always different. You'll see something totally different in 2 different days. In fact, as a tide goes in and out, it just changes it constantly, different times of the year, different light. And you can see the lovely light on the sand dunes in the distance there as well. But I think it was a year later, I was back in the same location. And this is what it looked like then. A storm is just on its way overhead. It's just passing by. And it's very hard to tell from this image, but the horizontal line across the sand you can see going from left towards the right is actually sand being blown almost in a wave in the wind. It's so windy. It's a very exposed location up here. And just to prove how windy it was, whenever I got back to the accommodation shortly after, that was the state of my camera bag, with everything having been sandblasted fairly extensively, and the camera itself. Now, I don't know if anybody wants to buy a second-hand Nikon. It's been very carefully treated. As we say in this part of the world, never raked nor rallied. Don't worry, this camera is long since gone, so you're not going to be subjected to that. But you can see, this is a few years ago when I was still using a D810. You can see the tilt shift 24mm lens, John, that we talked about at the start. Mm-hmm. That was much my standard lens on this camera. And this is again the same beach. This was the last day of a workshop group I had with me, when the group had been up for, I think, 5 mornings in a row, and the forecast was really quite poor. So about half the group decided they were going to have a lie-in, and the other half of the group decided they were coming out. And the other half of the group that were coming out were all from Ireland and Scotland. So you could argue maybe the more hardy ones. There were some people from Sweden and England who decided it was much too harsh for them. But you can see the raindrops and the filters. And this is exactly the same location, and it's fairly grim. But like everything, if you look around and you work it a little bit and you put your back slightly to the rain, I was able to find this. And again, this is straight out of camera, the raw file, and a little bit of lightening of that sand. I was using the arrow shape of the black sand and the lovely white sand to point towards that island is called Tarrantsa in the background. And that was the shot. And again, you can see those sand dunes towards the right-hand side that you see in quite a few shots. So, you know, very different weather, very different days, not necessarily particularly different times of the year. I often go to a similar time of the year, but it can create a very different look to the images. So never say you've done that place before, because there's always something new to be seen. And just another part of the island as well that most people never see. There are no roads, no motorized access to this point. You've literally got to walk over a mountain to get to this beach called Traig Mena. Scottish Gaelic term, and I discovered this a few years ago, and it's just one of those places you don't even get footprints of other people there. You might see a couple of walkers if you're lucky, but that's usually about the height of it. And just to finish off the Outer Hebrides, a lovely shelving beach. Most of my other work is typically 4 to 8 minutes long. This is probably only 4 seconds long, just to show the sweep of the waves on the fairly steeply shelving beach as we look towards the mountain in the background. And again, I look for these soft tones in the sky, the delicate colors, because I print a lot on a fine art paper. And I just like those delicate tones, the way they come out in a fine art paper. Okay, a bit of a tour around Portugal. And a couple of the people here tonight, Jerry and Hugh were with me on this trip. Hugh actually got up early to take this shot and Jerry didn't. And we were literally up at 3:30 in the morning. We'd hired a car the day before. This is Lisbon, city of Lisbon. You can see the lights in the background. And we got up at 3:30 to drive down to this Cascaqueira that certainly Hugh and myself were aware of before and had wanted to photograph for some time. So we arrived in the dark. We stopped at a motorway service area on the way down for breakfast, and we got a cup of coffee and I think a steel donut. And it just proved the point. Motorway service areas are the same across the world. Pretty awful for things like that. And you can see it's getting lighter, but there was certainly no sign of a nice, lovely, delicate sunrise. And in fact, there was no sunrise at all. The lights are still on Lisbon in the background. So it's very much a case of wait until the sun actually came up, and it did brighten up a little bit. No sunrise, but still that very low in the sky sun that gives a lovely delicate tone of light. This was shot actually on a medium format Hasselblad digital back with a technical camera, a Cambo, and quite an awkward thing to use in some ways, but it gave incredible detail in the image. And that was it corrected, just to remove. There's a bit of a cyan cast if you go back, which happens when you use tilt shift on a technical camera in a digital back. It's a known problem, but fairly easy to correct for as well. And staying in Lisbon, there was a crowd of us, as I say, there for a trip away. There's a crowd of us go away every year, usually about May time for a long, about 8 of us. And we tell our wives, partners, girlfriends, and so on that we're going away to take photographs. But the reality is we're there to enjoy a few nice glasses of wine and some good food as well. And we do take the odd picture in between, which we have to sort of demonstrate afterwards. And this is the Vasco da Gama Bridge. I think this at one stage was the longest bridge in the world, about 23 kilometers. I think it's about the 3rd or 4th longest. I think the longest is maybe in somewhere like South Korea. But again, just getting that long exposure. I was standing on a boardwalk, which was made out of steel and wood. And it was a Sunday afternoon, so lots of people were out jogging, families out walking, and every time they would walk past, the whole thing would shake and move. And I'm trying to do a long exposure. So it was very much a case of waiting until you got a clear spot. You would start exposing the image and suddenly a jogger would come around and the thing would bounce again. So eventually I got a 2-minute exposure, which was this. It was the longest I could manage to get. Almost black and white, but there actually is a little bit of color in the shot. I'm going to move across to Venice. I don't know if many people have been to the city of Venice, but it's one of my favorite locations. And it's where I suppose my landscape journey started, as I mentioned, back in 2008. This was taken a few years ago from a place called Academia Bridge. And it's an iconic location. This has been shot many times. And I'm not against the idea of shooting iconic locations. I try to find something a bit different, but I'll also shoot the common ones. And I arrived here something like 6 a.m. It was still dark, the lights were on. And there was actually a group of 11 Germans from a workshop group there before me. So my objective of being first there was foiled. But fortunately, the place I wanted to stand on the bridge, there was nobody there. So I got my spot and just stood there as it gradually got lighter until we get to the stage where it's getting quite light. And then I got my long exposure shot. Now, sometimes people say to me, how come there are no water buses? If anybody's familiar with Venice, there are lots of water buses in Venice and lots of traffic along the canals. And the reality is when you're doing an 8-minute exposure, they just don't show up. The only time you get any sign of any traffic is when you get a police motor launch or an ambulance motor launch going past, and the blue flashing light, even in a long exposure, does show up. But as long as you can avoid that, you can get the long exposure. And that was it after a little bit of post-production lightening of the shadows. And again, that's sort of your delicate tones in the sky that I'm looking for. You'll see in the sort of the mid-ground towards the background, actually, that dome is Santa Maria, Basilica Santa Maria, which was built around I think 1631, to celebrate delivery of the Venetian people from the latest outbreak of the plague, which was a common thing around 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And every time the plague would go past, they'd build a church to celebrate those that survived. What they sort of often forget is that something between 25 and 50% of the population died every time in the plague. So it was a fairly horrendous thing in those days, maybe better known as the Black Death. But round the back of Santa Maria that you saw there, looking across the lagoon to Giudecca. This island is called Giudecca. It's actually part of the Venetian archipelago, but it's a separate island. This is Redentore. This church was built in 1571 after an earlier outbreak of the plague as well. So you can see a bit of a theme there. It's a wonder anybody survived the plague in the Middle Ages to get through. But I've been sort of looking at this possibility for quite some time. Again, it's a morning shot, and this is the shot before I put on my big stopper and so on. And then this became the 8-minute exposure straight out of camera. Back to this sort of blue field, which was taken out in Lightroom afterwards, and it gave me that. It was very much a case of the lights just gave a lovely warm feeling to the shot. And you've got lovely reds and pinks.
Going back to the blue issue, cyan issue, Richard's asking if you always do that by a color temperature, or do you sometimes use a hue saturation adjustment?
No, saturation adjustment I find adjusts all the colors. The color temperature tends to give you either warmer or colder, so it affects the blue or the yellow channel. And if I still have a bit of blue in it, I will go into individual blue channel in the saturation and adjust only the blue and maybe the cyan, but I don't do the overall saturation, if that makes sense. And as I say, that's what that gives me. Mm-hmm. And I took the same shot just after with the lights out, and you can see that it just doesn't work. So if I flick back, the lights give it a lot more life than it has without the lights. So that was another 8-minute exposure that just didn't really quite work. But immediately after that, I did say that boats don't show up. The one exception is when you get a cruise liner going past, and this massive cruise liner. Fortunately, I got my shot. I actually saw it when I was last in Venice, which is just over a year and a half ago before lockdown. I think it was late 2019, November. I saw this very same cruise liner. So obviously Venice is a regular stopping off point for these liners. This is an example of a lot of people at the very start. My very first shot of the presentation was taken from St. Mark's Square, where most photographers go in the morning. I've actually stood in St. Mark's Square and watched as photographers get into arguments about who stands where. It's a really busy place. And this particular morning, I walked about 10 minutes along the seafront at Venice. And once I was 100 meters from St. Mark's Square, I didn't see another photographer. And I was shooting the same thing without the gondolas in the foreground. As we looked at San Giorgio in the background, another church, again built in late 1500s, early 1600s. And I just wanted to get this from a slightly different angle to that most people do. And that was it, straight out of camera, long exposure. As I said before, I cropped the left and right hand sides, and then I'm really just cropping top and bottom. Interestingly enough, this shot is one that I converted into platinum palladium print, and using Dan's technique of having a color layer jet printer, almost like a color wash, and then doing a platinum palladium negative on top of it. I don't have it here, unfortunately. I know Dan was joining us. He was the person, I think it was about 15 or 16 years ago, Dan, that first got me into platinum and palladium, and I've recently got back into it in the last 18 months or so. I'm thoroughly enjoying the process as well. So thanks for that, Dan. And just a slightly different angle. This is actually from that church. So you see that church there, Giudecca, on the right-hand side of that shot, where you can see like a stone pillar at the edge of, there's a little marina there. This is taken just from that location, looking back at St. Mark's Square. So again, a different morning using the angles there. And it's a bit of a sort of a hark back to the past and a panorama type image, because just the sort of nature of the composition suited up much better than square. The interesting thing about Venice is a lot of people will photograph around the city, but there's also these fishing huts in the lagoon. And the first time I photographed these, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe slightly longer. I was aware of them, but I didn't know anything about them. I'd only ever seen one picture of one of them, and it was quite difficult to find where they were. So I spent quite a lot of time in the winter researching and Google Maps and finding out information about how to get there. Eventually, to figure out where these were. And since then, quite a few people have asked me about the location, and I'm quite happy to share the information that you basically, if anybody's going to Venice, you get a water bus from St. Mark's Square to the Lido, which is a separate island. And then you get a number 11 bus down the lagoon for about 45 minutes, including a chain ferry. And you get to Pellestrino, which is a village where these fishing huts are. And the actual island is only about 200 meters wide at that stage. So only 200 meters, not very wide. The difficulty is seeing.
A couple of questions.
Yep, go ahead, John.
So on the Venice images, to get your 8-minute exposure, which ND filters did you use?
In terms of I used the neutral density graduated filter usually for the sky. Almost always use those. And if it's early in the morning or late in the evening, I'll normally use a 10-stop filter because the light is a bit lower. If I'm shooting during the day, as this particular shot is, I'll usually use a 15-stop because because it's so much brighter to start with, I need to slow it down even more. So a 10-stop is most commonly used, not always. Occasionally a 6-stop if it's quite low light, but mainly a 10-stop during the day, and then a 15. Sorry.
Daryl Ann is asking. Yeah, Daryl Ann is asking. Sorry if I missed it, but why is a 10-stop needed? Why not just stop down the lens as much as possible and adjust the exposure? Is it specifically to have the water movement look smooth?
Yes, that's correct. Because if I stop it down, let's say I go to f16, apart from the fact I'm going to get or even f22, I'm going to get diffraction, which means that my image is starting to soften. It's an optical problem. But even if I ignore that and I get my fastest shutter speed, I will still, or sorry, not my fastest shutter. If I get my smallest aperture and I take my ISO right down to my camera will go to 64, I could still be on a 60th of a second, and you don't get any smoothing of the water and sky. So to get that, I need to be in, at minimum, I would suggest of 30 seconds, and ideally 1 or 2 minutes gives you more smoothness in the water. And the only way to do that is in effect putting a piece of black glass in front of my lens. That's what it does really. It just reduces the amount of light getting through. Okay.
So do you ever have to deal with movement from suspension bridges?
The only time I had really a problem was when I was standing in that, as I say, boardwalk in Lisbon. Most of the time,
I showed a little while ago.
Well, that really isn't a suspension bridge. That Vasco da Gama bridge doesn't move. It might be a suspension bridge in terms of there's wires there, but there's no movement in them at all. It's such a substantial structure, so it doesn't really become a problem. You'll see some stuff coming up in France where there's movement. In fact, you'll see some movement in the next couple of shots where the boats in the lagoon are moving, but I quite like a bit of movement sometimes along with the stationary elements as well. Gives a nice juxtaposition. I mean, this is an example where you're asking about lenses earlier, John. Mm-hmm. This is where I was using a lens to get rid of all the stuff, because this is an active fishing village. This isn't a tourist area. You don't get tourists here at all. I've never seen another photographer when I've been down here. And you don't get lots of cafes and restaurants. It's working fishermen. And you have to shoot between these moorings and between boats. So I was using a 70mm lens just to isolate it and get this. Now, I call this a fishing hut. I actually think it's a waste disposal area for the fishermen, because every time I go, there's more, I suppose, don't know what you call it, just junk, for want of a better word, on this platform. So I think all the fishermen, dump all their stuff onto this from their own fishing platforms, but it makes quite an interesting composition in its own right. And that's the exact same shot at a different time with different light. And it just shows you go from that with the haziness in the background, you can't really see any background. And in this, you can see the Dolomite Mountains in the distance. They're probably 100 miles or more away, but they're still showing up. And that sort of, golden glow of sunset. Now, some people prefer that. Some people prefer, the simpler image with less color. I personally prefer less color, but there's no right and wrong answer. Subjectivity comes into photography, as we all know. Another fishing hut on a different day. This is one of the few occasions where I've actually removed the horizon. If you look back here, there's quite a busy horizon. It's not particularly nice. There are no mountains in the background. And I actually went into Photoshop and physically removed the horizon, which I don't often do. I've no objection to doing post-production work, but I just don't want to spend an hour on the computer fiddling around. I'd rather be fairly quick. Most of my adjustments take me 5 or 10 minutes, and that's the limit. And I talked about motion. This is obviously the boat's moving. This will have been a 4-minute exposure in this case of the fishing hut. You can see the mountains in the background again. And I quite like the fact there's movement in the boat. It gives a sense of time passing, which is really what I like to do. Sometimes people sort of say, well, why did you do the waters? Because it looks nice. Well, it does look nice, but it's mainly a compositional tool in my case, where I don't want the distraction of ripples or waves in the water. I like that smoothness because it simplifies the composition. And that's why I choose to do what I do. And the very last one of this was the very first fishing hut that I shot in Venice, the very first time I went down. And that's why every time I go to Venice, I'll spend a day in this part of the lagoon shooting fishing huts.
Excuse me, on the
Any
previous
questions?
image, what was the exposure on the previous image with the rowboat?
That'll be 4 minutes. So it's only bobbing about gently in the water. It was it was a very calm day, so it wasn't very much, but it's moving slightly as it's tied to that mooring.
And this is with what lens?
This would have been a 70mm lens. It was a 24-70 on the 70 end.
Thank you.
And it looked like you're using some sort of gimbal head.
I use a ball. That was my old gimbal head at the very
okay.
start. I just use a gimbal ball head now. That was my panorama head that I had on the system. But now I use a really right stuff, an American ball head, which is fabulous. It's lasted me for years. I'm fairly hard on tripods because my tripods are often in seawater.
Oh,
But they tend to eat. I probably should clean them more, if I'm honest, John, but I tend to stick in the back of the car. It stays there to the next location. Eventually, something goes in them. Every 5, 6, 7 years, I tend to replace my tripod. I'm trying to be better these days and actually look after them and wash them a bit more often because it gets expensive replacing a fairly beefy.
are you using carbon fiber?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they tend to not do well in the salt water.
Yeah.
No, they don't particularly like it. And I was in this location, Lofoten, 7 years ago, and I was using a Gitzo tripod at that stage, the Italian make, and one of my legs fell off. So I was feeling a bit legless in that trip. So a 2-legged tripod isn't much use. And I had some gaffer tape, and the gaffer tape kept the 3rd leg attached long enough until I got back home. I was able to sort out the problem. But losing a leg on a trip is really fairly disastrous when you're a long exposure photographer. Probably not much worse could happen. Picture of a friend of ours, Trevor, that will go quite often on trips with me, just to sort of show the location. This is Lofoten, for those that don't know it, off the coast of Norway, above the Arctic Circle. So a fairly cool part of the world. I was first there 7 years ago, and I saw no other photographers the whole time I was there. This trip you'll see here was 2 years ago, almost exactly. And I was shocked at the number of photographers and workshop groups and so on. And the good side of that was there were coffee shops open, which the first time around, nothing was open apart from one garage. So at least we were able to get the odd cup of coffee. But this was standing on the beach in Lofoten. I can't remember the name of the place. Uteklev, you call it, Uteklev. And I'm just standing obviously slightly off to the left of this friend of ours, Trevor, and trying to shoot this particular shot. This is a shot before the long exposure and before the filters all go on. And this is what I got. This was evening, no real sort of nice tone in the sky. I was a bit flat, wasn't particularly happy with it. So we went back for a sunrise shot the next time, not the following morning, but 2 mornings later. And this is what it looked like whenever we were there waiting. So I'm standing on these rocks. There's a few people walking along the beach, but there weren't very many people there at all. It was fairly quiet. And again, just waiting. And this was a shot straight out of camera. It's hard to tell on the screen, but there's a delicate sort of pinkish tone you'll see, maybe just about on the lighter area to the left of the mountain range. But again, I wasn't terribly happy with it. It was a little bit too flat for my liking. I went at this time of the year on the advice of a friend that lives, she's a Dutch lady that actually lives there. And she said, go the last week in February, first week in March, you're going to get the best snow. And it rained the whole week and we got virtually no snow. But I hung around and waited because I could see a storm coming across, and this squall suddenly hit. Again, straight out of camera. And process after that mountain, as you can see in the background, is just visible through the cloud and no more. I like the mystery of it. The lightness of the storm passing across, coming from the left-hand side and the rocks in the foreground. The interesting thing is by this stage, it was fairly, the wind had come, this squall, it was fairly unpleasant. I think there was probably a bit of hail as well, and the beach cleared. And my friend Trevor scuttled back to the car to get shelter. And I was the only person still standing out here to get this shot. But it gave me an atmosphere and a mood that I was quite pleased with in the end. So just because the weather's not good doesn't mean you can't get something that you're happy with. This was later on that same day. In fact, it was our last full day on the island. This is a place called Unstad. And Unstad is the most northerly beach for surfing. So this is above the Arctic Circle. And when we arrived at Unstad, there's about 3 or 4 guys who had just come out from surfing the waves in this particular beach. And I can't imagine the water temperature, but I'm guessing it was probably 1 degree or something like that. Not the sort of, and I used to surf a bit, and I can't really imagine surfing in that sort of condition. Fairly horrendous. But I was in this position, and this is the shot that I took. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize it looks a bit underexposed, and it is. This was 2 minutes into a 4-minute exposure, but I spotted, and I do watch out for this being a coastal photographer, I spotted this freak wave coming in, and I knew that it was going to be a problem, and I called out to my friend Trevor to watch out for this wave, and I braced myself. Now I'm wearing full waterproofs and wellies and so on, and it hit me just below my waist. Now, it didn't knock me or the tripod over, but clearly it moved the tripod, moved all of us. And I looked around and found out that it actually washed Trevor over, and he got very wet and was seen crawling over the rocks back towards the car once again. There's a bit of a theme going here. So I did a strategic move a little bit closer into the shore and got my shot here. But like all of these things, when you've been out in the fresh air for a few hours in cold water, all you really want is a cinnamon swirl and a cup of good coffee. Yeah, you have to reward yourself. Anybody who's familiar with Norway knows that the prices of things like that are horrendously expensive. But this was a little surf shop that was selling surf gear and hiring out surfboards, and had a little tiny coffee shop in the corner. And I don't think anywhere was more welcome to find after being out. The very last evening before we were due to fly home the next day, this is a place called Flagstad. It's quite a well-known beach. We've been there during the week. There'd been a little tiny bit of snow you can see on the mountain, but not an awful lot. And I'd spotted, these foam patterns in the sand. Now, when the wave went out and left the foam, if I did a 4-minute exposure, it soaked into the sand usually within a minute, and it didn't really show. So all of these shots are about 1 minute long, which is quite short for my long exposure shots. But as we're on this beach, suddenly this little bit of light just kissed the top of the far mountain, and you can see it's just lighting up a little bit more in the reflection there. And I was just in the right position with the foam to grab a shot. And that was that shot that you saw just a moment ago, cropped. And what I don't like to do is have a mountain going right across the image. I like to have space so the eye can travel around the back of it, which is why there's a little bit of space to the left-hand side. Lovely reflection, lovely light on the mountain. But immediately after that, that light disappeared, and that was it, gone. So you have to take the opportunity when it's there.
So Anya was asking if you ever
shoot.
But Anya was asking if you ever shoot the 4 to 5 hour exposures like Michael Kenna.
No. Michael, you've got reciprocity failure in film, which is part of his problem. So he has to do longer exposures to get the same thing. And he would also shoot quite a lot at night, which I don't do. Michael, like a lot of long exposure photographers, would often have their sky totally flat. So it'd be a flat grey of the sky, a flat grey of the water, and then whatever it is he's shooting as sort of the feature, if you like. Whereas you'll notice most of my sky, there is layering in the sky. So I like to have that layering in the sky. And you'll see that in just a minute.
Cool,
this
thanks.
is France's Gironde. And this is near Bordeaux in France. So we're doing a bit of a travel around the world here. The great thing about Europe is there's so many places that are, you know, within a 2 or 3 hour max flight. And I went again with my trusty tent, my luxury accommodation, and my dining room is obviously high end as well. But I was there to sleep in fishing huts. I had 2 days of storms, so I didn't really get doing an awful lot. And the very last morning, just the day I was due to move on to another location, these fishing huts, the light was just gorgeous in the morning. Because it's an estuary with mudflats, you've got to have the tide just right. And there was high tide, but the tide goes out quite quickly. So you've got to make the most of it. And I got, I think, 2, maybe 3 shots during this lovely dawn. This is it straight at the camera. And that's it cropped. Again, you can see layering. You'll see it probably better in some future images, but you know, I like to have some detail in my sky. If I had taken that shot over, let's say, I'd managed to do it over an hour, then I would have a bland sky. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it's a different style. I like to have a bit of detail and a bit of color tone in my skies. And the second one I got of these fishing huts were all quite close by. I'd researched them beforehand. There's something like 400 along a coast of 100 miles. But there was a grouping of these fishing huts quite close by, which made it a bit easier to get from one to the other. And you can see these clouds along the top. Whenever they're moving in a 4-minute exposure, you get this effect. So it's lovely and light behind the fishing hut. And then you've got a sort of much heavier sky, which frames the image quite nicely. You can maybe can't tell from the screen, but the fishing net is moving a little bit. There's a very light breeze. You can just see a little bit of movement on that fishing net, but everything else is stationary. And I just like the fact there was this post and this line, gave me a nice balance to my composition on the image. I then went down to a place called Cap Breton, much further down the coast of France, near Biarritz on the west coast. And again, this was a location I wanted to do. This was in May. So unusually for me, I was able to wander around in shorts and t-shirt. Usually I'm wearing, you know, multiple layers of thermal gear, full waterproofs, dealing with bad weather, which is so often the case of the weather we get in Ireland and Scotland. But this was one of the times it was a bit nicer. And this was it straight out of camera. You can just see some lovely tones in the sky. Again, you've got this blue from the big stopper. This would have been a 4-minute exposure on the big stopper. And this was removed then in post-production to give that. And you can see those lovely tones. But you see the layering of sky John I'm talking about that I quite like. Whereas a Michael Kenna, and again, I'm not saying, you know, one of us is right and one is wrong. He would have probably gone for much longer and that would have smoothed out even more. So probably even more simplistic than my work. And he would also be black and white, whereas I nearly always shoot in color. A lot of the time I will actually desaturate colors slightly across the board because I like the very subtle tones in an image. I don't like them to be bright and colorful. It wouldn't be a talk from this part of the world if I didn't do something from my home patch. My latest assistant, we saw Sam earlier. This is Freddie. Freddie's an 8.5-month-old Cocker Spaniel. This was taken from my house about 4 or 5 weeks ago with a bit of bad weather. And actually, I think my house is just in the background in those fields. But Freddie is a great landscape photography dog because he'll stand there and he won't wander off too far. And you don't need to be watching him because if you're doing long exposures, you get so engrossed in the image, you don't know what's going on. But this is a location that some of the guys here will probably recognize. It's called Boyater Bay in Donegal. It's better known as the murder hole. I've never quite established why it's called the murder hole, but I maybe don't want to know too much. And this was taken a few years ago. There was a storm in the horizon. It was quite a wild day. It's a wild and rugged place. It's only about just under 3 hours drive from where I live. So it's quite relatively easy to get to. And it's just a stunning piece of coastline. And that shot taken, again, not a terribly long exposure, probably 4 or 5 seconds to give a sense of movement in the water. I didn't want to give too smooth a feeling this time. I wanted to give a sense of the storm. So sometimes my long exposures will only be a few seconds. Most of the time they're longer. And you can see the lovely tones of the storm against the horizon. was about 15 minutes walk over some fields to the car. And on the way back, it literally started to rain, torrential rain. And I just obviously timed it right before the rain came on about getting the shot literally in the bag. And this is the same place on a summer's evening. It just shows a different feel, a little bit more to the right. So you look at that rock that you can see slightly on the third at the right. That's me shooting the same rock. So I'm probably 50 meters further to my right-hand side, and it gives quite a different feel to the scene in different weather.
Are we still looking at panoramas digitally stitched?
No, that wasn't a panorama stitch. That was just a straight shot.
Okay.
I very rarely do panoramas now, John. Sometimes my clients, I do some work for the tourist boards. My clients want panoramas and I'll use it for that. But for my own personal work, I generally don't do that these days.
Cool.
This is quite close to my home, taken 3 or 4 years ago in December, maybe slightly longer. It's called D Lighthouse. Most people shoot at the lighthouse. You can see a bit of an orange colored boat, which is actually the lifeboat. It's a local lifeboat station, and they shoot along the pier. And I wanted a slightly different composition, which I've seen since, but I hadn't seen before. I'm not saying it hadn't been shot, but I hadn't come across it. And again, this is a case of just taking the picture before I put filters on. This is the composition with some filters, just with a graduated filter to keep the sky in balance, and then straight out of camera. And once I lighten up the lighthouse slightly, take the blueness out and lighten the water in front, that's what I'm left with. Again, it's about simplicity. You can see the layering of the grays in the sky. I quite like grays with maybe a little touch of blue, so I like to see cloud.
So are your filters squares in a holder?
Yeah. My filter, my big stopper is a square filter. My graduated filters are rectangular, the Lee rectangular filters. They're I think 100, called 100 millimeter systems. So it's a 4-inch wide, but it's a bit longer than it is wide. And you move it up and down to get the horizon line for the graduation where you want it to be.
Nice.
I'll grab them at the end if people want. I'll show you them. The camera bags in the corner.
Great.
Sticking with that, this is a place called Inch Beach in Dingle, a very popular spot for tourism. A lot of people end up in Kerry, County Kerry, and it's another favourite spot of mine. About 6 hours drive, so it's not unachievable for a weekend. And I've been in this location a few times. If the tide is fully in, you can't see these stones. If the tide's fully out, it just looks untidy. So it's just the optimal time. And this particular day, I got it just right. And the key thing, a lot of people think I'm standing in the sand for these long exposures. If I stand in the sand while I've got a solid tripod, the water undermines the legs of the tripod and it gradually sinks. So you get a ghosted image of the stationary bits of the image. It's a bit like when you stand on the sand in the water with the sea washing around your feet and you gradually sink into the sand. It's exactly the same. So I need to find a solid base for my camera, or else I need to be out of the water on dry sand. In this case, obviously, I'm standing on the water. Again, with the gimbal, so this is quite an old picture. And that was the shot I got there. And you can see, the water's quite messy. There's lots going on. You've got waves. It's interesting in its own right. But if I want to simplify and draw the eye along the textures of the rocks, I need to smooth out the sea, and the same with the sky with the ring of Kerry actually in the background there. And again, in Dingle Peninsula, this was one of these, it's quite an old image. This was one I was actually taking the picture of the jagged rocks on Cunnamulla Beach, which is where Ryan's Daughter, the Hollywood movie, was filmed in the 70s. And all of a sudden, sort of bizarrely almost, you got this sort of pinky zigzag sort of shape in the sky. Somebody called it my Zorro landscape one time. And it was one of those things, sometimes you can just be lucky and you're photographing something and something just occurs and you just grab that shot. And that was one of those shots, as I say, where the lovely pink tones in the sky worked out, pinky purple. And I've actually desaturated that slightly because the reality looks slightly artificial. And if it looks artificial, even if it was real, then I don't want viewers to think that I've done something to it in Photoshop and wound the sliders to the right to make it look more zany than it actually is. And just another couple of final ones of Ireland. This is Downpatrick Head. I was actually doing some client work in this part of the world 2 or 3 years ago. And at the very end of the day, I just shot this for my own benefit. I had great trouble trying to avoid the left-hand pillar of rock. I didn't want it to actually touch the horizon. So it's just under. And the big one to see is just over the horizon. And I've got my tripod at full extension to get that. I couldn't get any, I could have done with a set of steps to get a little bit higher to separate them from the horizon a bit more strongly, but you make the best of what you have. And as I say, this is Downpatrick Head, stunning location off the, I think it's the Clare coast.
Looks like Michael has a question.
Yeah, can you go back to that previous image?
Yep.
Is it, am I imagining this, or has all of this erosion happened because of the levels of the tide and the sea volume itself?
I actually got a chisel out, Michael, and I chiseled it away inland.
So this is
sorry, I'm only joking.
So this is pre-Photoshop. It's pre-John.
This is pre-everything, pre-life as we know it. Probably back to dinosaur times. This is
that,
you know.
Is that the height of the sea at the time?
Well, the sea is at the base of these rocks, so the sea is quite low down. These are cliffs.
I think Michael's asking, millions of years ago, was the sea that high?
Millions.
The sea wouldn't have been that high, but the sea would have probably, big tides would have, I'm guessing it was probably an arch at one stage, maybe 100,000 years or whatever ago. And it gradually eroded the base. And I'm guessing the top then collapsed into the sea, which would be quite common around our coast to get arches. And eventually the arch collapses and it breaks away the rocks from the main part of the land. So I'm guessing that's what happened here, Michael.
Yeah, you was mentioning in the chat that differential erosion, the less resistant material goes first.
Yeah, that's right. And the softer rock, I'm not sure what sort of rock this is, but it looks like a sort of slate type rock, which would be, more prone to breaking away than some other rock.
Yeah, a few other questions have come in here. Richard's asking if you ever do tours of the Faroe Islands.
I've never been to the Faroe Islands. I've noticed that a few people have been going to the Faroe Islands and they look quite stunning, but I've not been there before and I've not run there.
John was asking if you do any HDR in your work.
No.
And go ahead.
I will try just to sort of expand that. I'll lighten my shadows slightly. I don't like heavily HDR images. Again, if that's what people like doing, I don't criticize others for doing it. But my images, I try to make them as realistic as I can as to what I saw when I was there. So of course I use post-production because the camera often can't, maybe capture every detail that I can see. But so I will lighten shadows, but not to the level of what people might traditionally call HDR.
And Anya is asking how much equipment you travel with, like in terms of kilos, especially with international travel weight allowances.
That's a very good question, Anya. Normally, I used to travel with probably closer to 20 kgs of kit in my camera bag. And again, I'm sure some of the guys that know me will remember a trip to Bilbao in Spain, whenever I was carrying medium format backs and technical cameras. I had this bag that was about half the size of me. But as travel has got stricter and luggage allowances have got stricter, I've had to lighten my gear. Also, as I get older, I don't want to carry quite so much. So I probably carry about 10 kgs now, which most airlines will let you get away with. If they question it, I'll stick some things into my pockets because they can't weigh your coat. And they'll weigh the camera bag. It'll be 8 kgs, which is the limit for some airlines. And they know perfectly well I'm going to put the lenses back after, but they've ticked their box. I've ticked mine, and everybody's happy. But I've got a bag that now fits into both regional and international flights baggage allowance.
And speaking of your camping gear, what are you using to keep everything dry from rain and even from humidity, especially in the tent when you're breathing?
Well, I'm usually in the tent. I don't use a tent that often, to be fair. I do use it in some locations, but if I'm in the tent, and it's anywhere, you know, in Scotland or Northern Ireland. We don't get humidity here very much. We just get cold, windy weather. So you might get a bit of condensation inside in the morning, but not too much. And if I just leave the vents slightly open on a warmer evening, I'm fine with that. I don't usually. France was an exception where I took my camping gear internationally. Most of the time I don't, because it's too difficult to travel with camping gear when you're going on flights. It's only when I'm taking the car somewhere and I can pack my camping gear in a rucksack, I'll take it with me.
Great. Let's go back.
Okay. And again, this is another Game of Thrones location. I can't remember what they called it in Game of Thrones, but this is Mussenden Temple in Northern Ireland. And this was actually taken last August between lockdowns. And it was just a case of using the foam in the sand to lead the eye into a bit of reflection. This is actually only about a 1 minute exposure. And I think Lee Filters were using this to advertise this talk just last week. And there's final four images here of, this is Fanad Head Lighthouse in Donegal. And just to show that you can find different locations, this is a beach round the corner from a lighthouse that I photographed. So you can get it with the tide in like this, or the tide out, and it gives a very different feel. But interestingly, I was doing some work for Board Fulcha, which is the Irish Tourist Board, about 3 or 4 years ago. And this was one of the locations they wanted me to photograph. This is a lighthouse from a different angle, the better known angle, if you like. And there's a lay-by about 50 meters away from where I'm standing. So it's quite easy to get to in the car. I drove down one particular day. This was September time. And the forecast was for changeable weather, which is what I like most. And instead of changeable weather, I got wet, miserable weather. And I was there from mid-afternoon. And I think sunset was at maybe 9 o'clock at night. And about 7:30, 8:45, I was getting fed up waiting. It was still raining. It was still grey. And I thought, well, I'm 3 hours drive from home. If I leave now at 7, I'll be home by 10 in time for a cold beer. But something about the whole thing thought, I've come all this way for the sake of another hour, hour and a half, whatever it was, the sunset, I'll hang around. And about 15, 20 minutes before sunset time, I spotted a very brief break in the clouds, and it was brief. And I grabbed my gear from the car and went out to the same place I was standing here earlier. You can't tell from this, but it's pouring with rain. And I got that. And it just shows the difference light makes from that to that. And I got a double rainbow, and that's not photoshopped. The sky's not replaced. The light lit the side of the lighthouse. I got a double rainbow. You got a little hint of blueness in the sky. It lasted less than 5 minutes and it disappeared. And then I was back to that sort of look again afterwards. So just, again, there's an element of luck and there's an element of waiting for the light. That's just landscape photography for you. I'm going to finish off with the final location. I'm sure this isn't Jersey in the States. This is Jersey in the Channel Islands.
I'm from Jersey.
In France. There you go. It's a different Jersey, I think. This
Yes.
one's 9 miles long by 5 miles wide. So it's a small island, but it's a beautiful island. And I've been photographing there on and off in recent years. It's been an hour's flight from where I live. And I happened to be on the island maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And I was there for a different purpose. And I just had taken a camera and some filters, and I must have forgotten to take my little travel tripod for some reason. And I was going to take some pictures of this lighthouse in the evening. And I didn't have a tripod, so I borrowed a cushion from the hotel I was staying in, a pillowcase. And I took the cushion and set it in the rocks, placed my camera in the cushion, framed the shot, did a 2-second delay, and then a 30-second exposure, and got that shot. So I suppose it proves the point. Even if you don't have the gear, you can often improvise and make the best of what you have. I was actually running a workshop a couple of years ago for a camera club. And I, as always is the case with the workshop, I normally end up going a few days early just to make sure everything is ready. And it gives me a chance to take some personal work. And I took the same shot, and that was it there. So again, same location. I'm slightly further out on the rocks this time, and just different light gives a different feel. And just to show you that a different crop can give a different feel as well. And that wasn't stitched, by the way, John. That was just a letterbox crop of the actual. And cutting it square gives a very different feel. That would have been a 24mm lens again. So 24mm there. And that's still here, but just cropped differently. So I'm literally standing in rocks. I'm quite a distance away, but close enough to be able to get it all those rocks into the shot. And as I say, just crop the top and the bottom of that. Okay. I was doing a panel at that stage. I was doing a fellowship for the Royal Photographic Society, and I was missing one image. And this was actually, I was in Jersey on holidays with my wife. I think this was about 3 or 4 years ago. And I knew of this location. It's called St. Catherine's Breakwater in the northeast tip of the island. And the 12 days I was there on holidays, it was wall-to-wall blue sky. It was hot, it was sunny, it was a glorious summer. And the only day there was forecast to be any high one particular evening when the tide was also high. And I knew that would be great for photography. But when I'm away on holidays with my wife, I'm photographing so much, I tend not to take pictures. But the day before, she started an advertisement for a choral concert in a church hall. And she quite likes that sort of thing and said, do you fancy going to it? And I said, it's not really my sort of music, but if you want to go, I don't mind in the slightest. He said, are you sure you don't mind? I said, not at all. So I dropped my wife off to the concert, made a mad dash up to the top of the island, took this particular shot, got the long exposure straight out of camera, as you can see, and got that, which became the top left-hand image of my panel. I then packed up my gear, back to pick up my wife from the concert. She was quite content. I'd got my shot. Everybody was happy. And that's the best formula for a family holiday. Just a couple of others of Jersey. Again, this is before the workshop a couple of years ago. There's an old outdoor swimming pool, which I've been trying to photograph for years, and the tides were never quite right. And there's a man standing at the end of the pier. You can just about see there. And in a 4-minute he didn't move at all, so he's absolutely stationary. Whereas during that exposure, I had the odd person walking up and down, and they didn't show whatsoever. The yellow castellated part of the swimming pool, you can see the handrail there. That's the same place with the handrail taken. Again, my sort of simple long exposure type shot. And then just to finish off, this was another location along the coast. I've shot this a number of times. This is just an iPhone shot. I don't know who would ever want to shoot an iPhone. Apologies to Dan and Jerry for that, but I had to say it. And you can see the rocks either side of the pier. I'm standing on the left-hand side. And again, just taking a shot with the boats. This is before the filters, after the filters. And I did remove some of the boats. I thought there were too many. I didn't mind a few moving boats. And again, you've got these sort of layering in the sky, sort of pinkish, purplish tinges as well. I mentioned constant to start. I'm a great believer in printing. I'm one of these photographers that thinks if you're taking pictures and you go to all the trouble to get nice shots, print your work. Doesn't matter what paper you use, just make sure you print your work, because in years to come, all these files are sitting on a computer. What will happen to them? Will they get forgotten and lost? So make sure you print the sort of work you're doing. If anyone wants any further information, my website's there, Facebook. I'm also on Instagram. I think it's John Miskelly1 on Instagram. Feel free to connect. And really over to you guys for any questions.
Yeah, feel free to unmute and ask questions now.
I'll stop sharing.
So do you also sell your prints or work through a gallery or an agency or anything like that?
I keep planning to sell through a gallery, but I don't get my act together. Ian, to be honest, I sell prints from my website. Unlike all photographers, I go through phases when people buy prints. A few years ago, I used to have a bit of a display in a gallery locally that was quite successful for me. But since it closed, and since then, I have just sold on the website. So sometimes you could have a few orders over a couple of weeks, and then you go for a month or two and you get nothing at all. So I keep planning to do more of that, and I'm going to produce a new series of platinum palladium, and for that I'm going to look for gallery representation to try to sell those. If you know anybody's looking for stuff, let me know, Ian.
And do you would you say a big part of the business side of what you do is workshops or
I do some workshops. I don't do vast numbers of workshops. I do some workshops. I do some commissioned work, and I sell some prints. I've been winding down a bit the last few years, so I'm not doing as much as I probably used to. But I still do that, and I do a bit of writing in between as well for the odd magazine here or there. Not an awful lot, but now and again. That doesn't pay you big money, as anybody that does any writing for magazines knows.
Is there some direction you see taking your work over the next 5 or 10 years that would be new to you, or something that you're looking forward to doing?
Yeah, I'm actually looking more at doing mountain photography. I'm a bit of a ski addict, and I spend a lot of time, and I've done a bit of ski touring and so on. So there are places that are quite difficult to access in ranges that I would like to. I'm not talking about the Himalayas or something as extreme as that. I'm thinking more of the Alps and so on. So I'd like to explore the possibility of doing a bit more mountain photography. And as I mentioned, I want to do a bit more platinum palladium, which I've been doing for the last probably year and a half. And I've just been rebuilding my exposure unit for that with LEDs at the moment. So that's just finished in the last couple of weeks. So I'm about to experiment and explore that a bit further.
Great. You go ahead. You have something else, Ian?
I was just going to say your work is quite spectacular, and it's even given me an idea of something to do. I'm very appreciative.
Great. You was mentioning photo pills, an application that'll help you determine your exposures when using the long exposure filters. Do you have a particular way? Do you usually take a shot without and then do the math to get down to the exposure you need for the filter, or do you use an application?
Well, photo pills, I have dabbled with it in the past, not in recent times. Photo pills is more a case of finding your sunset times and the angle of the sun and so on and so forth, rather than an exposure guide, unless it's changed, which it could have. I just use the Lee app that I download onto my phone that tells me, if I have a 10-stop filter at 30th of a second, it will tell me a 10-stop is 30 seconds. But you also, after a while, tend to get to know it. So I know that, for example, a 30th of a second of the 10-stop is 30 seconds. So if I'm in a 15th of a second, I just double that. I'm on 1 minute. And I sort of, I'm fairly used to my filter times that I know most of them in my head. But you can get little mini cards with the information on as well, because phone batteries have a habit of dying at the wrong time.
What f-stop are you generally using?
Sorry, what f-stop? Mainly F8 or F11, Michael, because of diffraction. I don't want to go to F16 unless I'm really pushed, which is almost never. I'll change the stopper to be a more dense filter rather than change my aperture beyond. The sweet spot is F8. It gives me good depth of field without any significant diffraction. F11 is still okay. F16, I can see a definite softening in the image. F22 is actually quite poor. And for those that aren't familiar with it, as you stop down your lens, the light has to bend in the smaller hole, it has to bend a bit more to get round to the center. And that causes an optical phenomenon called diffraction, which is not great.
Yeah, I usually think of it like putting your thumb over the end of a hose and seeing how the water sprays. It's what the light does at a small aperture.
That's a good analogy. I'll remember that one, John. I'll steal that one.
Good.
Certainly one of the great things about the work is it reignites that whole idea of photography is tied with time. And it's always been this sort of inhuman fraction of a second in most modern photography. The early photographers were dealing with very, very long exposures. And it's just really nice to see time encoded with your work. It's really quite appreciated, John.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if I think it was Jay Maisel said that most photographers, when they collect their body of work, their best work, it's just a matter of maybe a few minutes of time, because they're shooting at 125th of a second, or even 1 second, or 500th of a second. So if you add all of your images up in those fractional seconds, your best work is just a few minutes. But your best work would be hours. I just think it's ironic that you collect your photons over a period of time that gives, and Stephen Johnson has fought with this, and in some cases used it with an aesthetic that movement over time can become a thing of beauty. Although Stephen is often frustrated because he's trying to do long captures for motion pano, and he found that it's not easy to do that kind of shit like on a moving boat. But the other thing,
well, the whole point was to try, Jeff, right?
Yeah. The other thing, I know the whole point was to try. The other thing I was going to mention is I went to your website just to see the images because you went through them, and I actually am quite taken with your equine images, your horse images. I really love the and it's a different sense of time and motion than you know, your long exposure stuff.
Yeah.
So
most of those
good
were
on
taken
you.
at
No, don't worry.
in a second, so quite different, Jeff, compared to my normal work. Although some of those were dragged shots that were over a couple of seconds as well. So I tried to combine the two a little bit.
Yeah, I put a link to the equine in the chat.
Yeah, and Jeff, in reference to what you were talking about with me and the scanning back, the whole idea of or I should say, a lot of the beauty I'm enjoying in John's works are the artifacts that end up sort of appearing because of the time, the blur, the motion, the camera's experience of long exposure and an encoding of time. But the scanning back, it was a different thing. It was sort of that serrated version of time being encoded over a period of time, but still little slices of a second. Very, very different, but it became definitely an exploration of photographic time that was very good for broadening my notion of what photography could be. So I really appreciate John's work.
I had another talk which is slightly different to this, but not dramatically different. An earlier talk, and it used to be called Capturing Time, was the actual title of the talk. Or was that did I use that even in this one? I can't remember, but I call it long exposure landscapes now more, but my sense is I want to capture the sense of what I felt when I was somewhere, and I do that through time. And okay, it's not a realistic interpretation, but it's my own feeling. And to me, that's an important part of what I do, is capturing what I felt when I was there. And that's something I try to recreate afterwards with post-production as well.
Well, it's funny because realism is also a measure of perspective. And our perspective of time is a particular perspective. We're allowing with technology to have another perspective on time, just like with ultraviolet or infrared photography, another perspective on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's all about broadly thinking about how photography can encode both experience that we can perceive and experiences beyond our perception. And it's just fascinating. And like I said, I appreciate it.
Yeah, speaking of post-processing, Anya is asking if you ever do online editing workshops.
I haven't, but I'm thinking about doing them. So, subscribe to my newsletter, which I don't do very often, if I'm totally honest, but I'm planning to do one quite soon. And if I do that on you'll see it on that. But I'm thinking about doing some of that, especially with lockdown. It would make sense to do something along those lines. It's not that complicated, if I'm totally honest. That's the downside. There's no real mystery in what I do.
It's just getting out there and actually doing it, huh, John?
Yeah, that's exactly it, John. I prefer being out taking images and spending lots of time in front of a computer. We all have to spend time in front of a computer. I mean, that's what we're doing now with the pandemic. But normally, I like to be out as much as I can. And I think, like many of us, I'm looking forward to the vaccine hopefully allowing us all to get out a bit more in the near future.
It's beautiful work. I appreciate the opportunity that John Quarticello and, of course, yourself there from Ireland. I guess one question, I'm kind of the novice in the group here. When you do your stitches, do you have a particular pattern that you prefer to follow in doing your stitches? I've seen them done a couple of different ways. You start left to right or right to left, or low to high, or some say to start in the center and then just kind of spiral your way out. What's your suggestion?
I usually, not always, but usually start left to right, but occasionally I'll do right to left. I'll overlap by about 50% from one shot to the next. Some people say overlap by a third, but I always take the view I'd rather overlap a bit more than I need to in case there's a problem after that I need with in post-production. I have a bit more to work with, but usually it's left to right. As I mentioned, a couple of times with longer lenses, I've done multi-row panoramas, but to be honest, do I want to be taking 25, 30 images and then stitching? It gets quite complicated. That's fine if a client needs a very, very detailed image. But really most of the time, our modern cameras, the megapixels are so good to start with. Once you stitch, 3, 4, 5 images together, you can print those, really huge without any problems and getting, large amount of detail.
Thank you.
I would also add to what John said. I would be inclined to shoot in vertical as opposed to panoramic because of the way in which the lenses are designed. You'll run into a little bit less perspective distortion, as it were, if you're shooting vertically as opposed to horizontally. And also the other thing is, wherever possible, keep the damn camera plumb and level. If you're tilting up or down, shoot it wider as also, because you lose a lot of image in the algorithm that does the combining. So you need a wider image to start with so that you can crop into it. Hi, Michael. What do you want?
Yeah,
I want you.
Don't go in the song, Michael. Don't go in the song.
Yeah, years ago, when I worked for as a Nikon school instructor, Nikon used to make, and I was trying to find it. I've changed you can see I've changed where I exist now, where I have a lot more room, but everything is a mess right now. But anyway, Nikon used to make a thing that you would put onto your regular tripod. It would have in it a bubble level, and so you would plumb out your tripod, and then you would put the camera onto this round, thick disc. Screw it onto the quarter 20 thread, and it had detents built into the unit itself for a 20, 24, 35 millimeter, 50, 85, and I want to say 135. I was trying to find it, but I can't in this mess. And you would put the camera on it with the lens, and depending on the lens you were using, you would turn the little dial underneath it, and all you had to do was rotate the camera to the next detent, and it in fact would be set up in a place for your panoramas. It was so incredible that, in the old days when we all used to shoot chromes, transparencies, it would take into account the 1 or 2 millimeters eaten up by the slide mount if you weren't using full frame mounts. Now, I decided I was going to use that when digital started taking over. And if you use a full frame digital camera, it's perfect. Absolutely perfect.
I'm just wondering if this Manfrotto device that I put into the chat is similar to that. And John Shields mentioned that Really Right Stuff has, and Kirk has similar.
This is a Really Right Stuff leveling head here that you can see with the levels in them. There are different levels for different bits of it. There are more levels in there. So all of my kit I can level through that Really Right Stuff head, which is great. So it's a bit like what you're talking about, Michael.
But does it maintain level as you arc the camera, as you twist it around?
Well, but here's the thing.
Yes.
What I noticed, if you do it by eye, And the biggest problem I have with the stitching, if you do it by eye, I mean, it works out that you're overlapping too much from one image to the next, and it's a real pain in the rear end. But this particular device is incredible, and I forget what it's called. And I did have it in my camera room, and now I can't find it because my brain isn't locked into what the new configuration looks like. So
two things. What Jeff was just talking about for leveling, and what John was just showing, can be fixed with a cinematic head. Keep in mind, when you're doing a pan in movie making, you can't have the horizon suddenly going crooked as you pan. And you don't want to be trying to level tripod legs because that'll just drive you nuts.
No, but this
basically, Michael, just let me finish.
Yeah,
it's basically just an overall bar that you loosen, and then you've got bubble head, a spherical bubble head, and you can level that, which levels everything above it as well. And that's what I use for all of the panoramics with my National Parks project and the scanning back, where the whole 4x5 gets leveled before you do anything else.
Well, but in this particular device, the bubble is on its own separate platform. And then on the platform is this device that just rotates around that platform. So no matter where you place it, the horizon line is going to be level according to the bubble.
Essentially accomplishing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. But the whole thing is about this big. That's all. It's about that big.
A few years ago,
Go ahead.
I was in Death Valley in one of the Painted Canyons or something. And there was a guy holding obviously a workshop, and it was I believe it was a tour, a workshop from people from Japan, probably 6. I think they were all shooting Hasselblad, and they all seemed to have a computer device, a computerized device on their tripod that moved the camera for them. I didn't stop and talk about it, but I was wondering, has anyone seen something like that before?
I mean, it almost sounds like an equatorial mount that you use for.
Well,
Go ahead.
Gigapan makes a device that moves the camera in both directions, both vertically and horizontally, so you can take many shots.
Same with Cam Ranger, I believe.
Yeah, the danger with some of those things, I always take the view is they rely on batteries and technology. And when you're out in the landscape, sometimes no matter how careful you are with gear, something will go wrong. So if you can do it manually and avoid using technology, then all the better, I reckon.
Yeah, Patty was asking, are you shooting a bit wider so you can crop out any vignetting? And what about any light leaks? And I'm not sure where the light leaks would come from. And
yeah, I don't get light leaks because the seal between the filter and the holder is really good with Lee. In terms of I tend not to get vignetting because most of my work, or not so much now, but in the early days, was a 24 tilt shift lens. And because the image circle is so large, even when I'm not tilting it or shifting it, I wasn't really getting much vignetting at all. So that wasn't so much it. I would always go a little bit wider than I needed so I could crop afterwards, because there's nothing worse than being cropped so tight and then thinking if I'd only left a little bit more breathing space. So I'd rather have a bit more and crop it down than have a problem the other way around.
yeah, Stephen, did you have something you wanted to show us? You're muted. Okay.
This isn't exactly what we're talking about, but I've been saving this for a while. This is just a rotation device that I stumbled across on B&H one day. So I'm not going to type in the link right now, but if anybody wants to do a quick screen capture. Anyway, it doesn't do the leveling part. It just automates the rotation.
Yeah.
I mean, Stephen's absolutely right in the sense of the leveling is the most important thing. If you're not level, your stitching will struggle to stitch the various bits. You'll get all sorts of strange effects. If you get a level, consistently level pan, then that's most of the battle in terms of stitching afterwards.
So did you have to figure out the nodal point on the lens and slide forward and backward on your really right stuff to get that?
That's what that allows me to do. I can move that up and down
Mm-hmm.
to suit points. So yeah, I did. I worked out the nodal point for all my different lenses.
Okay.
And I would adjust it accordingly. It didn't have to be critically precise to like a degree, but it had to be pretty close, within maybe 5 mil or something, or a centimeter away from it, and it worked pretty well.
The nodal point is only going to really matter if you have some really near things and some far things,
Mm-hmm.
so that they'll shift in relation to each other.
That's right.
Right, a parallax thing.
Yeah.
Right. But quite often I was doing near and far, Stephen. In fact, a friend of mine told me one time, you can't use a tilt shift and do a panorama. So I then spent the next couple of weeks experimenting to find how much. I couldn't get away with lots of shift, but I could get a little bit of shift and still stitch them together without any strange effects. But you're right, I have to be careful of, there's so many factors you have to be careful of once you add more things into the mix, but I enjoyed the challenge of it at one stage.
We don't talk about Adobe PostScript much anymore, but that's sort of how PostScript started, when John Warnock figured out how to do this parallax correction on some things he was working on, and that turned into Illustrator and then to everything else.
Well, it's funny, PostScript was also a big problem on limiting the size of my original panoramic prints. There was a 273-inch limit in PostScript that was causing a lot of print drivers to fail when I tried to make these big prints. The other thing that I got away with on the nodal point issue with the scanning back is because it was turning the whole camera and making these little tiny slices of time. There was no really detectable shift in perspective because of the tiny slices of recorded image were so fine that it just smoothed that whole process out entirely. So with the 4x5 and the digital scanning back, nodal point wasn't an issue, but it was when we did all the QuickTime VR research with Apple in 1995.
Yeah.
Well, no problem.
Excited, Michael.
So John, one question here, and this kind of ties into what Jeff Shui was asking earlier in terms of doing more vertical slices. And it got me to thinking, when you do your landscapes, are you shooting, is the orientation, are you shooting in a portrait or a landscape? And because of the orientation of the lens and trying to, again, as you're cropping in and leaving yourself a little cushion there to avoid lens distortion, and staying closer to the center for, I guess, a more truer view of what you're seeing. Can you touch on that in terms of what you do? And then maybe Jeff can comment in terms of, is that something I need to be thinking of if I go to a portrait?
Are you talking about panoramas here or the single shots, John?
No, I would be, I'm talking in the stitching and back in the single, if it's a single shot, it really doesn't matter because it's just one image. But if you're stitching,
stitching, I shoot vertically, because if you think, if I stitch horizontal images that are already 3x2, I get a very long, narrow image with not a lot of space top and bottom. Correct. If I shoot horizontally, I've got more space. I've got to take more images to get what I want, but I've got more top and bottom. And I just find it a more pleasing thing. And it's really, really, my very first panorama I ever shot in Scotland, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago or whatever it was, I shot normal landscape format. And I ended up with this really long, thin image that just looked odd. So after that, I always shot vertically, and I just liked that format.
And then you crop in to eliminate what happens on the ends with respect to the 24mm lens.
Well, I don't need, with the 24mm lens, because I had really little distortion on my lens, because it's such a good lens, I didn't have to crop because of distortion. Yes, there is a little bit of distortion in most lenses, but you've got two things. One is these days in Lightroom, you've got a lot of really quite good correction, but even in the earlier days, that wasn't quite so good. Because I'm using a tilt shift lens and you know the image circle's so big on it, if I'm only shooting in the middle, I've not got much distortion, and vertically you would see less distortion vertically than you would if I was shooting horizontally. So that what Jeff was saying was absolutely correct about that. but that wasn't a big issue for me. It was more the aesthetic of it that drove me to do it. But distortion was a benefit as well, that there was a lot less of that. If that makes sense.
I appreciate you clarifying that, because I imagine doing your stitching using it in a horizontal mode, and then Jeff's comment made me get to thinking. I was like, I think shooting it in a portrait would make a whole lot more sense for a variety of reasons, and you've just confirmed that, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem, John.
John, you still with us?
I think so. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I have no idea what happened. My laptop just rebooted in the middle of the Zoom conference, but I think everything's still running here. It's still recording, but I'm going to turn us off of Facebook now.
Got a lot of editing in this
for
one.
joining us.
I was going to say, one of the questions, I'm just looking at the questions here from Horace, and he's just mentioned that they were just watching Men in Kilts. I'm not quite sure what I've got to do with Men in Kilts, but that's maybe a question I don't want an answer to.
I don't think we need that one. Yeah.
No, it's just that
I
part.
can answer that. And I've really enjoyed this, by the way. Men in Kilts is a show that's broadcasting here on the Stars Network. And it has two Scottish actors touring Scotland and getting into mischief and looking very elegant while they do it.
All right, okay.
Oh, this is David Letterman. Oh, no.
It's my victory beard.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. It's been a lot of fun. Any last minute questions for John, or any last minute comments from John?
I'm just going to say thank you, John. This was really, really good. And your work is truly spectacular.
Yeah, I would second, third, and fourth that in whatever numbers to express my appreciation.
Ditto.
Yeah.
Thanks, John and John.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks a lot, John.
Yeah, very much. Absolutely.
Great work, John.
Good.
Thank you, John.